All right, and finally, on the topic of the field types, let's quickly zip through some of the others that you might encounter for different use cases. We're not going to get into detail with them at all, since most of them have the same sort of validations and presentations as the other fields. First up, we've got the date and the time field. You could choose whether to either have just the date or a very specific date and time. This is particularly useful in cases where you maybe need to associate a timestamp with a content entry for things like a changelog or a press release. Looking into the date time field, for example, you can see that under validations, you could specify a very specific date and time range. So any entry made would only be between, at least, or no more than the sort of value specified here. There's nothing new when it comes to the default value. You could have something in place for editors. And on the presentation side, that's just a simple help text. Next up, we've got the number field. Here as well, you have two options. If you're working with, let's say, purely whole numbers for things like manually ordering certain objects or setting a sort of star rating for any content entries, you'd most likely go ahead with using a whole number. For slightly more specific use cases like working with a lot of statistical data or maybe having statistics when showcasing customer case studies on your website, you'd probably go with a floating point number to allow for decimals and fractions. Nothing changes on the validation side apart from being able to specify a range. On the default value and the presentation as well, this remains relatively unchanged to the other fields. Next, let's take a look at the Boolean. A Boolean is a very simple sort of toggle either or approach for when a value could either be a yes or no, or when you have just a single choice to make from multiple options. You could have the sort of field enabled by default or disabled, since that's the only options you can really have on a Boolean. And on the presentation side, you have two options here. So if you're working with, let's say, something like a product catalog where a product is in stock or out of stock, then you could have a toggle switch just to show whether it's in stock or not. If you're working with more options, let's say, is this product available in orange, green, or red, and there's only one option to choose from, you could have a radio group where editors could select the applicable value for this entry. Then we've got the location field. Now, the location field could work in two different ways. You could either have a sort of coordinate, like a latitude and a longitude combination, or since Dato uses Google API under the hood, you could also have a street address. Now, this would be very useful for building out maybe an about page where you want to have office locations, or building out a store locator page where you have multiple stores or outlets in different locations and you just want to have all of their street addresses in one place. Next up, we've got the color. Now, the color field is, it accepts hexadecimal values or RGB, and this would be not very used from what I've seen so far, except for when there's certain brand guidelines to consider, or again, in the e-commerce use case, when there's color variations that need to be entered. So here you do have a default value option to be set, which could again be a hex or an RGB. And on the content editor side, you can choose whether or not there is a sort of preset that they could go and select from. So this is particularly useful for branding guidelines where maybe your theme is certain shades of purple and pink and orange, and there's very specific hex values to choose from. You could also have the option to let editors control the alpha channel. What this means is the sort of transparency, something you might have noticed in PNGs, which support transparent background versus JPEG, which doesn't. And finally, we've got the JSON field. This one is not one that's very commonly used on the editorial side. It is a field where you would just have sort of arbitrary values dumped in a JSON format. Not very common if you're building out a website or an e-commerce storefront, but if you're working with more technical content, could be statistical data, could be metadata, or anything that requires some small snippets of code. Maybe you're firing specific CRM communications and you have timestamps and targeting as part of a JSON code. Very, very specific and could get very complicated. So let's keep this one relatively unexplained because it's something that would require quite a bit of technical insight from the engineering side as well. And there we have it. That is a very quick look into all of the field types available within Dato. So moving forward, hopefully we will all start being a lot less confused as we build out some more real-world models and blocks that we will eventually use on the content editing side to see what the editorial experience in DatoCMS is like.